So welcome everybody to our last talk today, our last session before the book talk. It's a really long day, but so I'm going to introduce Vladimir, who's very happy to have him with us for the first time in Beirut, although we've met on various accounts and other places, and there's so many connections to be made in terms of the work also that Vladimir does on psychoanalysis and philosophy. So Vladimir is a professor at the Universidad de São Paulo. He's invited professor at the universities of Paris 7, Toulouse, Louvain, Essex, and Stellenbosch. He's the author of, among others, La Passion du Négatif, Lacan et la Dialectique, and Grand Hotel Abyss, Desire, Recognition, and the Restoration of the Subject. And he's the editor of the Portuguese translation of Adorno's complete works.
Okay. Well, first, thank you so much for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. I will try to present a text on, let's say, a possible notion of emancipation derived from the Lacanian psychoanalysis. And I would start saying that in 1967, Lacan presents a fundamental text on psychoanalysis and politics, named the Proposition of October 9, 1967, on the school analyst. Well, faced with the need to justify the functioning of an institution that he himself created, the Freudian School of Psychoanalysis, Lacan presents a text of clear political connotation, whose central axis will be the reflection on the structure of transference. Such a choice could not have been otherwise. If it's true that psychoanalysis thinks the process of constituting social ties from the dynamics of identification, and if it's a fact that there can be no social bond without some form of identification, since identification aims to explain the productive dimension of power, the way in which power produces psychic life, mobilizes affections and demands for love, constituting the subjects to which it relates. So it will be the thematization of transference that can open us to understanding the ways of abandonment of domination. In this sense, there is a reflection on emancipatory process that appear as the true consequence of transference. And taking into account the exercise of power through identifications, all possible emancipation will take the form of a liquidation of transference, with its questions related to the fate of the experience of knowledge, the subjective destitution, and the dejection of the analyst. No? Well, a distinction must be made here. Identifications show how social relations are necessarily power relations and repetition. In identifying with something or someone, I assume the implicit development proper to what I have identified with. The structures of my psychic life and its developments will be produced by what I have identified with. That is, all identification is an exercise of power. However, not all power relations are relations of domination. For we can remember how the sustaining of identifying process is ultimately given by what neither I nor the other is capable of mastering. There is something circulating in identification process that cannot be understood as the exercise of domination. Such processes take place on the basis of something that surpasses all will of the subjects, and which Lacan thematized through his theory of object A. Something whose own circuit always insists within the relations of power, and which makes such relations unsteady, always ready to reverse, to drift off. Well, let us insist on one fundamental point. A relationship of domination is the expression of the submission of my will to the will of the other. but there is something which allows for the circulation of power, something that is neither my will nor the will of the other. Something that produces bonds without being the expression of the will of a subject, which is the expression of an unconscious dynamic of affects. After all, Lacan understood perfectly well that if one goes into analysis, it is because there is an assumption of knowing about the truth of one's desire. This assumption of knowledge is not only a cognitive curiosity, a desire to know oneself better, but is an expectation of reconfiguring the structure of practice and care based on self-knowledge. However, this supposed knowledge will fail down, not by the simple observation of the analyst's ignorance, or by the ineffectiveness of the analytic discourse, but by the emergence of an object that sustained the relationship and which was hitherto veiled. And this explains why in the analyst discourse it is this object that occupies the place of the agent. And at this time it is revealed to the subject how his connection or her connection with the supposition of knowing was in fact a link to an object that caused him or her, which he or she took from him or her. And analytical knowledge is realized by destituting itself. Well, an example here, a classical one, is given by the Lacanian reading of the dialogue between Alcibiades and Socrates in the banquet. In a certain sense, Lacan's reading makes Socrates the first analyst, just as he makes Socrates' response to Alcibiades' desire the first lesson of managing the transference that we would have known. In the dialogue of Plato, Alcibiades is not only someone who does not know how to govern himself, not being master of his own desire. He is the one who hopes to govern the polis, to govern the others. In a sense, Socrates is the one who tries to show Alcibiades how he will not be able to govern the polis before governing himself. However, self-government in this context is not, at least for Lacan, self-domination with its dynamic of control and self-regulation. In fact, one can even say that governing oneself is inseparable from the capacity to recognize, and I quote Lacan, the rest which, as determining his division, makes himself fail from its fantasy and destitute him as a subject. Socrates shows Alcibiades how there will be no self-government if he is unable to confront the object that caused his desire, but to confront itself in a space where such a relation to the object produces a traverse of fantasy and a destitution of the subject. For this reason, Lacan emphasized the way Socrates says that Alcibiades is wrong about his desire, because despite their statements, it's not exactly Socrates who Alcibiades desired, but the algamata that Socrates wears. Socrates does make an operation of separation, insofar as he tries to show to Alcibiades a distance between the ego ideal and the object which supports it. By exposing such distance, Socrates produced a kind of short circuit in the identification system that has supported Alcibiades' position, since the ego ideal no longer appears as it appeared before, as the point of transcendence compared to imaginary objects. It appears as a clothing that supports the subject by preventing him from confronting an object without place, which nevertheless causes him, acts in him, and constitutes him. Well, for this reason, it is necessary to insist that if knowledge in transference is a supposed knowledge about my desire and what caused it, the analytic process aims to extract the object that caused my desire from the paths of knowledge. Socrates says nothing to know and to know anything about things of love, which does not mean that he does not know what to do with such things. It only means that his action is not oriented by deliberation, is not oriented by a shared knowledge that fits within a symbolic structure. His actions are a form of openness that presuppose a destitution of domination, a form of recognition of an external causality, upon which it is useless to seek to defend oneself. Lacan then speaks of an operation of confronting the truth, an operation distinct from the operation of the exercise of knowledge. And here this distinction between knowing and truth is fundamental. Well, Lacan himself acknowledged that this initially seems to mean the impossibility of constituting any formal social bond. And I quote, "The subjective dismissal inscribed on the entrance ticket would not be the subjective destitution inscribed on the entrance ticket would not be to provoke horror, indignation, panic, or even the attack in any case, excuse the objection in principle. Well, for what may be a bond constituted from the liquidation of the transference that seems to preclude all symbolic identification, which can no longer mobilize any phantasmatic production, and which makes Lacan affirm that, and I don't know if it's possible to quote in French. Okay, because, well, if I try to make the translation, this will be a catastrophe. Dans ces virages où le sujet voit chavirer l'assurance qu'il prend de ses fantasmes, où se constitue pour chacun sa fenêtre sur le réel, ce qui s'aperçoit, c'est que la prise de désir n'est rien que celle d'un des êtres. En ces des êtres se dévoile l'inessentiel du sujet supposé savoir, d'où le psychanalyste à venir se voue à l'agalma de l'essence du désir, prêt à le payer de se réduire, lui, l'analyste, et son nom, aux signifiantes quelconques. Okay, it's not easy, but let's go. Huh? This is how Lacan describes the process of liquidation of transference. And let us first note how it is a question of breaking down the security provided by fantasy, by being a window onto the real, by framing reality over a certain distance and in a certain operation. There is a temporality of fantasy, a time marked by repetition and by the modular updating of the original experience. What happens at the end of the transference is that the subject approaches the real, experiencing a temporality outside the fantasy, outside the structure. When such security produced by the fantasy falters, the desire reveals itself as nothing more than a désêtre. It means not exactly a form of registration of the subject into the ontological security of a being taught through normativity as a necessity, but the drift of a dispossession. The desire can then be shown as the drift of a dispossession at the time of the real, and the time of the real can appear as a drift. This shift from being to des êtres, to the être, to des êtres, is characteristic of the destitution of the analyst's knowledge. That is to say, in analysis, the analyst goes through a des êtres, which presupposes anguish, and the patient goes through a subjective destitution, which implies a certain helplessness. This destitution is described through a change in the structure of recognition process. Because we don't have self-recognition in another subject. We have recognition in an object. And such recognition is made in such a way that it reduces the name of the subject to any signifier. That is to say, its name, his, her, or his name, which establish relations of filiation and transmission, which bears the marks of the description in the horizon of a family constellation, becomes any signifier, in the sense of a purely contingent inscription, without place in the chain of needs. The symbolic re-inscription that the analytical interpretation can produce through the mobilization of the frames of relations specific to the Oedipal complex and its normative horizon are destituted, so that the name appears as any signifier. But the central question remains, why this process would not be simply a depressive process? Why this process would not be simply the dead time of a melancholic process? And what makes it a process, on the contrary, of affirming emancipation? Well, to answer such question, let us begin by asking ourselves how to finish a transferential process. And of course, this question can only be answered on a generic level, since the paths of an analysis are always unique. But this does not mean that such generic level is devoid of importance and interest, that it does not reveal a structural trace. And we will then say that the transfers is liquidated when what Lacan calls the analytical act occurs, an act that can answer for general problems of emancipation. And let us first recall some considerations about emancipation as a normative horizon for political struggles. Because we know the traditional tendency to derive discussions about emancipation from the regulatory notion of maturity, as if we were generalizing consequence of the distinction between minority and adulthood. Thus, political struggles guided by expectations of emancipation would be struggles to realize forms of development as an individual capable of self-deliberation and self-affirmation. However, well, if I had time, I would like to show how all the last generation of Frankfurt School entering this mistake. No? But however, we must insist that this way of thinking about emancipation does not allow us to distinguish it between subjection to disciplinary patterns socially required and necessary behavior, patterns which are usually enunciated as an effective expression of autonomy. Living minority can be understood in this frame as a result of the internalization of systems of judgments and socially accepted actions that are proper to those subjects who are held imputable and responsible. In this context, there is a risk that we will no longer be able to draw minimally operative distinctions between emancipation and a mere social adaptation to legal patterns of imputability, or even between recognition as the establishment of unpredicated modes of existence and acknowledgement as a confirmation of potentialities achieved by the current modes of existence. Thus, a condition of historically defined and legally organized socialization turns into an ontological stable horizon for regulating forms of life. However, in its own way, the notion of analytic act allows us to see emancipation appear as a possibility for the subject to emerge as a normative power capable of producing singularizations. But in order to do so, a structural change in the notion of agency needs to occur. In this regard, let us remember how Lacan states that the analytical act would be grounded on, I quote, a paradoxical structure arising from the fact that the object is active and the subject is subverted. A subversion that is an inscription of the position of the subject into the real. Well, we return to this point because such an idea of an act capable of inscribing the subject in the real is central. It implies that in producing an act, subjects act from what collapses the symbolic order. Therefore, they lose their previous inscription in the symbolic order and the order of knowledge that constituted them. And this is why, from the clinical point of view, the concept of analytic act ends up globally reconfiguring the process of analytical intervention by putting in second place the mechanism of symbolization to the significant inscription produced by interpretation. From now on, then, the analysis will not seek, through interpretation, to provide subjects with inscriptions within a regulated framework of conflicts and affiliations. It will confront the subject with an act that deprives them of such a place. And this explains why, in the device of the analytic act, a force of dissolution and an operation of establishment are linked. And all its complexity lies precisely in the understanding of this double movement. It's not possible to think about process of establishment of constitution without answering the question about how dissolutions are carried out. For there are dissolutions that are only degradations of the previous order, or if we wish, which are mere passage to act, mere fascination with annihilation that removes from the act every possibility of recognition. And for this reason, the classic forms of passage à l'acte are linked to suicide. However, there are dissolutions that are pressures of new orientations. And I would like to remind that one of the fundamental questions for reflection about political action is how to make orders collapse. Considering what the experience of revolutions in the 20th century has shown us, orders can be perpetuated even after their fall. Or rather, they can be perpetuated exactly because they have fallen and become an implicit mode of existence rather than an explicit one. They may then resurface as a recurrence that reappears when we less expect it, or they may continue to operate in an underground stratum, gradually eroding the new order until it becomes unrecognizable. And for this reason, the question of the political act as a process of dissolution is of a paramount importance. Oh, I have 20 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. I will try to. Okay, great. Well, such discussion brings us to the power of negation proper to every act. At various moments, Lacan brings the analytic act closer to a possible reading of the political concept of revolution. And however, a distinction must be made here, because in various circumstances, Lacan insisted that revolution usually means, as we know about astronomical movements, to return to the same place. In commenting the Copernican revolution, so often used as a metaphor for epistemic change in philosophy and even in psychoanalysis, Lacan wondered, I quote, what is revolutionary about refocusing the solar world around the sun? Because there was no change in preserving the hierarchy, the unity and the centrality represented by the notion of spherical motion as a perfect celestial form. The true revolution was in the advent of the elliptical movement, that is the notion of two centers and the form of celestial and as the form of celestial movements. Insofar, Professor, the truth is not insofar revolution, if it does not wish to be a return to the same place, it's inseparable from a change in the structure of knowledge, not only in the place that each element occupies within a given structure, not only in the holders of knowledge and power. For its place, Lacan appeals to poetry in order to think of the revolution that an analytic experience really entails. And in this respect, let us remember a poem important to Lacan that appeared to him as an expression of the, I quote him, general formula of the act. Arthur Rimbaud, a une raison. Well, I found a translation of the poem, but you know, translation of the poem is always a murder, but okay. A tap in of your finger on the drum releases all sounds and initiates the new harmony. A step of ours is the conscription of the new men and their marching orders. You look away, then you love. You look back, then you love. Change our fates, shoot down the plagues, beginning with time. The children sing to you. Build wherever you can the substance of our fortunes and our wishes, they beg you. Arriving from always, you will go away everywhere. Well, first, it should be noted that the general formula of the analytic act is given by a poem. It's a question of approaching the act and the emergence of another regime of language expressed in the form of the poem. If the language appears here in the fundamental position, it is because it decides the form of the experience, the dynamics of our grammar of affects, of the structure of our sensibilities. There is no real revolution without a transformation of the capacity of enunciation of language. In this regard, well, I apologize, but I would like to quote Stalin. I will quote that Stalin's discussion. I never thought that I would do that, but you know, this is a part of the job. Stalin's discussion of language not being a superstructure, no? Since it could not be changed by modifying the relations of production. And then Stalin. No? What could be the need for such a linguistic revolution if we demonstrate that the existing language and its structure are fundamentally suited to the needs of the new system? The old superstructure can and must be destroyed and replaced with a new one in the course of a few years in order to give free rein to the development of the productive force of society. But how could an existing language be destroyed and a new one built in its place in the course? A few years without causing anarchy in social life and without creating the threat of disintegration of society. Who but a Don Quixote could give himself such a task? Well, you see, Stalin, who knew very well what it means to kill a revolution, refused language as a superstructure because it must be neither the vehicle nor the result of a revolutionary process. It must remain as it is, at the risk of unleashing anarchy and disintegration. However, one has to wonder what kind of revolution is this that sees the instauration of in the language field as something beyond its scope. For to assert that language does not change is the surest way to assert that a revolution does not change in what appears as a precondition, at least for the speaking subjects, of every possible experience. For the restoration, it is essential to state that language does not know political dynamics because it expresses the totality of society. However, let's say that if Stalin had read Nietzsche, he would know that, I quote Nietzsche, "We will never let go of God as long as we believe in grammar." This was a way of claiming that there is an implicit metaphysics in grammar. And what makes a revolution is to dissolve this implicit metaphysics that guides the most elementary process of our forms of life. It is with this in mind that we can turn to Rimbaud poems and its use by Lacan. And first, let's remember the title, For a Reason, une raison. The general form of the act is linked to a poem entitled For a Reason. And what is most obvious here is the idea of a reason and not the reason, as if it were to say everyone has his own reason. But a sentence of this nature generally seems to mean there is no reason because everyone has his own. There is no truth because everyone has his own reason. If there is no reason, there is no ratio. Not only in the sense that there is no common measure, but especially in the sense that there is no generic implication, which is the ground of truth. Every process of truth is a process able to produce a generic implication, universalistic recognition. If there is no reason, it seems that it has nothing that involves us generically, nothing that gives us a common field. There seems to be only one word, one word and another word. No? However, the poem expresses exactly the opposite idea, as if the singularity of the experience that produced the body in which a reason burst was an experience that can be recognized by everyone. And if what was unveiled was only the opening of a common that is still out of the world. It's clear that the poem begins with a horizon of war and music, as if the real war was the transformation of language into music. It begins with a drum beat, as we announce the creation by breaking the silence with a sound, usually dry, without resonance. But now this absence of resonance is the advent of a new harmony produced by all sounds. But let us note, however, an important point here, because all sounds played together can only produce a cluster and never provide a new harmony. A touch that relieves all sounds can actually be perceived as a sound capable of producing any harmony, much like the substance of our fortune and our desires that can be cultivated anywhere, as the poem said, such as what will become with you everywhere. That is to say, we are talking about a relation, because harmony is necessarily a relation, without restriction, a relation without loss, without which can potentially operate in a time and a space that no longer knows the finiteness of the determinations. And as the outbreak of war with its chains and dominations is transmuted into music, the poem produced the eruption of new man and a new love. A new love that needs to be repeated, which is not just said once, that has to turn your head back to call once more, as if love would be what must be repeated, as if love would really be the scene of a repetition, or as if love would be what allows repetition to exist in its transformative power. It shows us how reason arises in this new love. Because like the reason, love is a question of relationship and existence in the relationship. As Rimbaud will say in another poem, Génie, quote the poem, love, perfect measure, and had reinvented wonderful and unforeseen reason. And by producing this repetition, we denounce a desire for establishment and duration. The poem opens to a song, a children's song whose music evokes a destination that should change and the time that should be targeted as a plague open to what always happens, to what suspends the very order of time. The children not only sing, but they pray. They pray because they feel the urgency of the desires that are cultivated in a place out of place, in a anywhere out of the world, and it is now composed and divided. An act is always the triggering of another time and another space. It is its function to allow the desire to be cultivated in another time and another space, breaking the hierarchy of places that desacralize distance. In the sense, it is not by chance that Lacan chose Rimbaud to provide a general formula of the analytical act, because Rimbaud is the poet who speaks of a time of revolutions, who will write poems about popular emancipatory battles, which will leave the versified poem, which will make language approach a colorful system through phonetic work with vowels. That is to say, Rimbaud is the one who will produce a new aesthesis in language and in his force of expression, by exploring significant dimensions elaborated beyond the purely semantic modes of determination. An eruption of all the sense, as Rimbaud himself says, which is the advent of a new constructive principles. And remember how the poem, For a Reason, was written between 1872 and 1873, that is to say, just after the Commune de Paris. And that gives a very concrete expression of who are these new men, who are these who rise and live in a new harmony. Well, this must be kept in mind when we hear Lacan say, I quote, "The act takes place in a saying and it modifies the subject," or "The act destitutes in its end the very subject which it established." This demonstrates how the analytic act is close to saying that instead of merely externalize the subject, it modifies him in a paradoxical instauration of destitution. This paradoxical position may explain why, I quote, "the act is best accomplished by failure," which does not mean that every act is a failure. There is a kind of failure that is a result of the pressure of the productive of the desire toward new forms, as the failed acts express the failure of the determining forces of ordinary language. For one must feel the ordinary language to fail, to confess its powerlessness, and to transmute its categories. Or as Lacan said, "Mon épreuve ne touche à l'être qui a le faire naître de la faille qui produit le temps de se dire." Well, it is at this point, and I promise that I'm finishing, that we can understand the political implication of the concept of an analytical act. It allows us to think about the political notion of revolution beyond its submission to a restoration dynamic. What is only possible by the act shows us more clearly what is the true dimension of transformation that a revolutionary action must produce. And at least for Lacan, it is related to the modification of the structure of knowledge and power. But, and this is the decisive point, it does not simply push the knowledge previously assumed by the other towards a knowledge now present in the consciousness of the subject. This does not mean that we are reappropriating knowledge. His displacement would only be the reiteration of the same regime of knowledge and action, which is only now available to consciousness. It is useless to praise the practice if this praxis still depends on the same grammar of knowledge that we were subjected to. That a grammar composed of ideas of autonomy, of deliberation, of choice and decision that necessarily refers to the mode of representation of consciousness. It doesn't matter who actually acts when one always acts from the same grammar. In any case, it is the grammar that acts. It is the system of rule and existence that acts. An emancipated praxis is not the result of a transference of knowledge. Emancipation is not a transference of knowledge that would allow us to recover the enunciation of knowledge, which would allow us to better deliberate. Let's remember an important statement, and it's in French. Ainsi, l'être du désir, rejoint l'être du savoir, pourront renaître à ce qu'il s'est nu en une bande faite de seul bord où s'inscrit en seul manque celui qui soutient l'également. Okay. I understand this in this way. Desire and knowledge meet as both sides of a Moebius strip. They pass into each other. A passage that occurs only under the condition of assuming a torsion. They make this passage the inscription of a lack, which is not a lack simply related to the incompleteness or to the subjectivation of castration, understood as the assumption of finitude, but which is the emergence of an object that is not reduced to what a signified chain can represent. When a knowledge of desires is possible, it is only by a torsion, which is from the point of view of the present configuration of knowledge, is a lack. But let's insist on a fundamental point. If something is lacking, it's because I don't have it. If the articulation between desire and knowledge inscribes a structural lack, because such an articulation points to something that I can never have, which will never be under the sign of my possession, and this is exactly one of the main features of agalmata. The subjects do not have them, they support them, which is totally different. This is a way of saying that the destitution of knowledge, that is the condition of the liquidation of the transference, has something of the assumption of another word, of another relation to language, a language that does not seem exactly mine, a knowledge that does not strain the delusion of my property and my domain. Hence, statements such as tout ce qui est de l'inconscient, everything that is from the unconscious, ne joue que sur des effets de langage. C'est quelque chose qui s'est dit sans que le sujet s'y représente, ni qu'il s'y dise, ni qu'il sache ce qu'il dit. Well, more than being structured as a language, the unconscious is a discourse that lays down the very talk of the subject. It is the emergence of a language that no longer appears as mine, not only because their utterances are subject to the involuntary, but mainly because it is no longer the language of meaning and the restoration of the property produced by the dynamics of meaning. This is the language of a truth event. And of course, and now it's really the end, this notion of meaning, which Lacan works with, has its specificity. After all, what can be a language that is not a language of meaning, but a language of a truth event, as Lacan assumes in speaking of the unconscious? Among the different ways of discussing this problem, let us insist on the one that exposes the political dimension of this debate. And let us remember when Lacan forms in a text where it is about the political act of the solution of an institution which he himself created. And I quote that: l'international, puisque c'est son nom, se réduit au symptôme de ce qu'elle est, de ce que Freud en attendait. Mais ce n'est pas elle qui fait poids, c'est l'Église, la vraie, qui soutient le marxisme de ce qui lui redonne sang nouveau, d'un sens renouvelé. Pourquoi pas la psychanalyse quand elle vire au sens? Je ne dis pas ça pour un vain persiflage. La stabilité de la religion vient de ce que le sens est toujours religieux. This is the Lacanian way of saying that the real political problem we face is the resurgence of the theological political dimension of power. Religion is a means of supporting social bonds through the reduction of political demands to the demands for protection, to the constitution of authority by figures of pastoral power. So, to say that meaning is always religious means to say that psychoanalysis should be able to emerge from what cannot be object of care, because it is not thinkable within the relationship of necessity, of confirmation of the original destiny, or the substantial unity of redemption. Lacan is not afraid to speak here on religion, on a certain Marxism, and of the bureaucratization of social ties by an international, the IPA, which is maintained only by fear of the analytical act. It should also be noted that the ground of religion's experience is based on the circulation of a certain notion of time, the time of providence, of redemption. In this context, meaning can only appear as a relation of necessity guaranteed by a ground originally situated. Meaning restores what has been lost. It heals us back to an original ground. Thus, the main construct is between meaning and event, meaning and truth. If Lacan criticized Marxism, it is because he understands his theory of revolution from a historical eschatology in which the proletariat appears as a subject-object finally reconciled. In this eschatology, every event is cancelled under the weight of a time which is none other than the projection of an irresistible realization of progress. Well, this is not the only reading that we can make of Marx's theory of revolution, of course. However, Lacan adopts it, at least at this moment. Contrary to this time, the analysis plays on the destitutive time of the cut and on a revolution which can appear as a real space of the event. But what can psychoanalysis offer in the face of criticism of religion, utopian politics, and the rise of bureaucracy? If we return to the question of how we know that we are not in front of stylization of depressive position, we must insist on the relation between act and jouissance. For what leads to an act of this nature, an act beyond sense, is the displacement and depersonalization that the experience of jouissance necessarily produces. There is always a relation between act and the attempt to transform the impossible of jouissance into a figure of a form of future relation, giving body to the impossible. Thus, in the transference, it would not be possible for the subject not to be driven by the emergence of a jouissance beyond the forms of symbolic inscription of desire. This is exactly what allowed the liquidation of the transference, its non-consolidation in a simple relationship of suggestion and dependence. And let us finish on this point. In the transference, there is always an emergence of the character without place of jouissance, as we see, for example, on the oral enjoyment of the Ernest Chris patience, haunted by his desire of pleasureism and his decomposition of the illusion of being altered, or the enjoyment of a Ratman before the description of a Chinese vicissitudes. Transference, in its destitution of knowledge, must allow the emergence of such enjoyment, as distressing as it is. But it must allow for the emergence of enjoyment, not to reassure the subject that its enjoyment is not threatening, not to show that there is a place for it in the possible administration of life, as it happens in the current situation. In fact, psychoanalysis tries to show how the helplessness character of this jouissance brings with it a political truth, namely the fact that the condition of the material reproduction of life to which the subject is submitted are possible just through a desire of know nothing about this enjoyment. With this enjoyment, it's impossible to do anything. It was necessary to ruin it and forget it. That is to say, the character without description, the real nature of this enjoyment, entails transformation and singular productions. If the subject is capable of assuming, of producing an act which is the very form of the non-description. In this sense, we can better understand the importance of statements such as enjoyment is what truth finds in resistance to knowledge. If truth is what resists to knowledge in the name of enjoyment, then the action of truth will always be a destitution in the name of an impossible situation to come. Instead, thank you.
Hi, thank you. It was exciting to hear you read Rimbaud's poem. I know nothing about, outside of your lecture, Lacan's treatment of poetry, or this poem in particular, but it's always been my favorite, or since I read it, it's been my favorite poem, and I especially love the last line, coming from always, you'll go everywhere, because, I mean, personally, what it's always meant to me is this, like, transfer from this temporal infinity to a spatial infinity. And like at this point with this comma, there's a change. And I was wondering if you could speak more to, I guess, what this last line means to Lacan, or means to you, or revolution, or just, yeah, like think more about this line.
Of course, yeah. No, but by the way, thank you for the question. Yeah. If I wouldn't say in 3 points. The first one is there is a very clear social context for this poem. It's really a poem about the Commune of Paris. Yeah. And we should really understand that as, let's say, all this movement that the war became music, and this music is a music that open to a place that is an unknown place. Is a place without a place. No? Is a place. Is where, if I remember, in French is. Well, how do you find this in French? But by the way, I will try to find. But the idea is exactly that. It means something that came from the place that is not identified, and that can open a space that is not named yet. And this is a very clear strategy to insist. What is being discussing here is in which sense a new social experience is also an experience that ruins, that open a new type of aesthesis, but an aesthesis in a very strong sense. It means it's a structure of time and space. It's a precondition of time and space that is changing. And this idea that a revolution is always a new emergence of time, something that is really, let's say, a part of the dialectical tradition, since Hegel saying, well, but the real political act is something that repeat again, that create this kind of strange presence, where something that was past now is present. And this, we see this from Hegel to Benjamin, for example. I think this is a very important point in the Lacanian interpretation of this poem. Even if, well, what Lacan do is he insists in the notion of new love, because he linked the notion of new love to the notion of a new signifier. What the analytical act must produce, well, to create a totally new signifier. But the interesting thing is not a new signifier in the old chain. But what this will mean? This mean just a metonymic drift. We pass from a signifier to another. But this is the desire to do every time. The question is, this new signifier is really something outside the chain. This is a kind of break in the chain of significance.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vladimir, for your talk. I always keep coming back to this idea of how the important or fundamental question of analysis is not how people go into analysis, but specifically how they step out of it. So in a way, concerning the analytic experience, we will never know if there actually was an analytic experience until after it was over. However, my question revolves around the idea of a key element concerning analysis, which I think it's central, especially for Freud, which is regression. How would regression function in relation to emancipation, and as to how, what you're proposing? What is the relevancy of regression in this sense?
What are the means that you take regression in this context?
Well, going back to Freud, he always understood regression in three terms: topic, dynamic, and formal regression. I do not understand regression as this idea of going back to earlier stages of life or something like that, or breaking away from something that it's holding us back. It's more about this idea that a key ingredient in the operation of analysis is precisely how to situate this regression within that space. How would that operate in relation to emancipation?
Well, maybe we can use this notion of Erinnerung that is so important to understand this process, and even for Freud too, this idea that, well, there is a kind of presence and a memorization. And this inner, that's something that's inside, but it's a process of it's not just a process of memorization, but it's a process of construction. That is very clear. It means there is a reinscription on everything that was a structure of determination of behavior, and something that I think that Derrida was very aware when he wrote this text, Freud and the scene of writing, exactly to insist which kind of memory is that. It's not a memory as an archive, but it's actually a processual memory, a kind of processuality that shows how, in a certain way, the historicization that is as a part of the analytical process it's not concerning about, let's say, is concerned about the possibility to resignify and erase the inscriptions of the past. But what I think that it's linked with the notion of emancipation. It's you see, it's not a question of let's say to take consent of the historical process. No? Let's say in a way that, well, as the process of emancipation will be the constitution of a type of historical conscience. No? I think there is something more complex and more interesting. No? It's the understanding that there is an opening that there is an openness in the past, no? And this opening in the past allowed the subject, no? to break all chains of determination. No? It means I would say psychoanalysis is not a deterministic discourse. No? It's almost exactly the opposite. No? Is the possibility that, well, there is a kind of plasticity that is proper to the experience of the past that can be reinscribed. No? And this, maybe it's the reason that, well, we saw many Lacanians using this this notion of this to put together the notion of Natäglichkeit of Freud and the Hegelian notion of Unmachen, the Unschöne Machen. How say this in English? No, but in English is
retroactive erasure.
Yeah. To change the past. To change it. But this is a very interesting thing because, for example, Balibar once, he wrote something like, well, Deleuze was totally wrong about Hegel when he said that Hegel is a kind of dialect is a language of resentment, because maybe the problem is exactly the opposite. Because the resentment is the fixation in something that happened in the past and you cannot change. You should repeat it, and something that produces pain, and you need to change to show this again. But what happened in the Hegelian perspective is this: it's an unbelievable transformation of every violence in necessity. It's exactly the opposite of resentment. We can say, well, this could be, that there is this idea that the wounds of the spirit is healed without cicatrices, without scares. And I would say there is something like that in the analytical perspective. Even if you accept, well, okay, there is some things that are impossible to oblige, that are impossible to forgive, that is the unforgivable or something like that. But the effect of that, this will change. So there is also a type of inscription, and a retroactive inscription in a certain way.
Well, thank you, Vladimir. I just had 3 small footnotes, not really questions, something. And the first one concerns about the ending of symposium, and you never mentioned the person of Agathon, because for Lacan's analysis of the end of symposium, essentially for the Socrates occupying the position of the analyst, first he says, I don't possess the Agana. And the second thing he says, he is the real object of your desire. So there's this pointing to the real of the other's desire, basically, that he sees as also an analytical dimension. So it's a minor one, but just you only concentrated on the question of the absence of Agana. Well, there is an object of love. But the second point concerns the question of the use of poetry. The use of poetry in evolution, and I would just remind that in the 18th Millennium, Marx speaks about revolution, and he says the revolutions of the 19th century had been drawing their inspiration from the past. They were always repeating the past models in order to be able to accomplish their revolutionary mission now. But the proletarian revolution will draw its poetry from the future. So it will be a repetition, but it will be a repetition of something that doesn't exist yet. And that which doesn't exist yet is actually poetry, which belongs to the future. It's very curious that Marx's own use of the word poetry as essentially related to the revolution. And the third minor comment is just what you were just talking about, the question of ungeschehen machen. Actually, Freud himself uses the word ungeschehen machen, which is a kind of which is a common word actually in German. It's a common word. It's not. It's impossible to translate well, but it's in German it's common. And Freud takes it to be a self-delusion. It's a defense mechanism that one tries to retroactively erase. But from that Freud's remark on ungeschehen machen, it follows that this doesn't succeed. It will necessarily fail. You can delude yourself, you can retroactively erase something. So you have Freud saying exactly the opposite of Hegel, and well, I would say Hegel was right.
No, thank you so much, Nadia, for these 3 questions. First, I think you are right. There is this movement that when Socrates shows this, your object is circulating. No? I mean, you think that it's with me, maybe it was with me, but now it's with Agathon. And I think it's a very important remark because, well, let's say the structure of Agalma is exactly this type of structure. It's an object which the properties of the object pass to the subject, but pass to the subject that in this moment is not really the possessor of the object, but the trading of the object. And it's true that I should have done this in this debate. About Marx, oh, this is wonderful, because if I remember well, when Marx said something like, well, our poetry is on the future, is not in the past, I think that it's because, well, poetry in this moment was really a political question. No? It means if we think about what happened with the poets in this moment, they became politicians. No? Lamartine was a politician, Victor Hugo too. And there was always this image that, well, no, the revolution should be repeated again. And then, of course, they repeated the revolution because they repeated with another Napoleon. They put another Napoleon as a way to no, let's try to do again. And what I think that Marx is saying, so no, we need to finish with that. We need to finish with this story. We finish because now this is just phantoms. There is no real event that can come from here. And even this poetry, that is a poetry of this time, it is a poetry of a restoration. It's a poem of Lamartine. Is the poem that this conservative romanticism that insists in Catholicism, that insists.
You know that Lamartine was in Lebanon.
Yeah, in Lebanon.
There's a valley in his name.
What?
Yeah.
But why?
Travels in the east.
Why you don't shoot him?
Why don't you shoot him? You weren't here. You weren't here. We could make it
She brought up Lamartine. Yes,
of course. But my impression is it's a question to insist, because even in 18 Brumaire, there is two types of repetition. There's a repetition that is just, let's say, a restoration, but there is also this Hegelian notion of repetition. That's a repetition that, for example, when he said something like the bourgeoisie, they used all the signs of the Roman Empire, not just to create this kind of ideological instauration, but to open a space for things that they cannot be able to control anymore. Because it's not just the signs of power, but it's also the signs of the fights, of the struggles that came back again. Then I think that this question of poetry in Brumaire is also, in a certain way, is not something that to say our poetry will not be a resonance of the past, but our poetry will be a poet of the future, because this deadly repetition will finish. This repetition of this revolution that is just a restoration, this will finish, and something different will start again. And the third question about well, the understanding, the Freud understanding that this plasticity of the past is an illusion, is true. I think that's because he say always as a defense mechanism in the obsessive neurosis, but of course this will fail. But I would insist, for example, one of the interesting things in the first seminars of Lacan is to take this back in a certain way and insist, but there is a type of historicization that is a reinscription of the past. And if we can always say, but even Freud tried to do that. It means in the Wolfman, the way that he tried to organize in a certain way, well, the times of the trauma in the Wolfman. It was something like that. It was a way to say, well, but the last trauma, the trauma that appears when the patient is telling what happened with him, he has 7 years old. Well, it's a way, or at least it's, yeah, you can say, but it's a fake. No? But it was a way, in a certain way, to create a construction in analysis. And this construction in analysis is a way is a certain way to repetition. This is not exactly the mechanism of defense of obsessive neurosis. No?
Yeah, we have to. Sorry, we have to bring it to an end.
Yeah, sure.
But we'll continue tomorrow. So
yeah.
Yeah. So
thank you so much for the questions.
Yeah. Thank you.